Howard is a PhD student of Paul's. And so you
True.
have a deep, deep relationship with Paul. And you have so many talents and experience that you bring to ProSocial. But when you more or less incorporated ProSocial into your toolkit, and then did these two extraordinary interventions, which are now way back, and um, but really didn't receive the attention they deserved, and I think, and because they're so important. And so what's new is to have written it up in a way that its significance is properly emphasized, and also the amazing follow-up, so that we can show that not only did what you do work, but these agencies, quite large as a unit of to work with, not only did they improve, but they continued to improve. And so you would actually created a more evolvable, a more adaptable organization. And of course, that is the ancestor really of the methods that we are using today. And so first of all, I want to express my really deep gratitude for your inclusion, involvement in our community, and everything that you contributed to it. And then to hear in your own voice your handling of these two cases.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's going to be a delight to speak to them. And thanks everybody for joining us for this. It's as you said, David, it's actually been quite an experience being a part of ProSocial and implementing the methods that we're using. And these two cases, two government agencies in Australia have well, it's been wonderful to actually look back over the work that we did and the results we've got. I'll tell the story a bit later in today's presentation. It's quite extraordinary. I did the work, a bit more than 8 years ago, and very recently caught up with the new leader of this agency to learn of the sustained change, which was delightful, as you can imagine. But anyway, let's get into it. I'll share my screen and we'll step our way through a presentation and then make our way to some question and answers. So what I wanted to do is provide an overview of our programmed approach to participatory action learning and research, which is what these two programs were, and follow that by a quick overview of the philosophical framework that's underpinning this work, which for me personally is in the camp of the behavioral sciences. It's a world that Paul and I have spent a lot of our time learning and growing in. And then I'll present these two case studies, not only these two, but some others that demonstrate both the flexibility and the impact of this kind of work. And time permitting, we'll then segue into some question and answers. How does that sound? Good. So first of all, our approach. I'm sure a lot of you are well acquainted with some of the things that I'm going to speak to now, but this is a very recent framing of the processes that we endeavour to enhance when we're doing any of the work we're doing in ProSocial. We're striving to increase the self-awareness and responsiveness of individuals by helping them vary their responses to the world and select those that are actually healthier and retain and replicate those. But equally, for groups, we help them develop a sense of shared purpose and direction, which is akin to creating a symbolic niche that will allow the groups to actually take action, which is kind of captured in the last circle, collective action and coevolution, which is really a process of participatory action learning, cycles of participatory action learning. And all of them are evolutionary in their approach. The idea is to vary, be flexible enough to vary responses and select those that work well, and to retain and replicate those that are actually taking us in the direction that we want. And another key distinction that we make is between these processes and the various methods and procedures you can employ to actually enhance them. Personally, I like to think of these three processes as very natural. Every sentient human being is aware to some degree and is always responding to their context. How well they're doing it is another question. And the methods we can employ to enhance our awareness and our capacity to respond is many and varied. And this infographic was rendered to kind of draw that distinction. For example, the tools that are in our toolkit, the matrix, DNAV, listening and dialogue or contemplative practices could be used to increase self-awareness and responsiveness. But equally, in terms of shared purpose and direction and collaborative action, there's also this suite of possible methods and procedures, foresighting, analyzing a system, developing circles of trust, engaging in process-based work, based on the extended evolutionary meta model, those kind of things. And so for me, this is also a very important distinction, because when I've worked with people, it's served us well in terms of opening up the conversation, inviting people to bring best practice to the table. It's not been about any particular toolkit that I or a colleague have had. It's, we jump in the passenger seat next to those we're working with and invite them to do a deep dive into how they are making sense of their world and responding, and what's working well and what's not. And while we might use our own methods, the matrix is very popular. The CDPs, of course, are fundamental. Any methods that they're using that are working, we encourage those we're working with to use them and to evolve them. And the other interesting thing that I think that is probably apparent to all of you is this approach is underpinned by these three bodies of science. You'll notice at the top of this page, Conscious Cultural Evolution. Conscious is about the behavioral sciences, increasing awareness and responsiveness. Cultural is science of collective action, particularly based on Ostrom's work and the work of Paul and David in generalizing her principles, but also the evolutionary sciences, variation, selection, retention, and multi-level selection. And so that's been another critical distinction in our work. Another very, very useful distinction that I make and we continue to make in our work is the distinction between needs and values and any strategies we might employ to get those needs met. And this is an acknowledgement that just most conflict happens at the level of strategy. And when there is conflict between individuals or stakeholders in a system, it's, for me at least, and I think most of you would agree, it's an indication of a lack of sensitivity to the needs and values of those that they're in conflict with. And so the work that we endeavor to do is to slow the conversation down, enhance perspective taking, so that the needs of all those who are implicated by any decision are central to any decision-making process. And any value that they might like to bring to the table in order to enhance well-being. And we recognize that there are four essential categories of need. This is informed a lot by self-determination theory. We recognize that each individual has a class of physical needs, for example, food and shelter, but also psychologically, emotionally, we need to experience freedom, connection, and a sense of meaning and purpose in life, agency. The same four classes apply to a group. We need environmental health, sustainable resources, but also groups need sovereignty, their own freedom. They need partnership and shared purpose. And so we try to have those classes of needs center stage. You know, the statement at the bottom, which is very much informed by you know, the folk in the nonviolent communication camp, Mickey Cashton particularly. You know, what if we embraced human and planetary needs as our primary organizing principle? Taking a direct and insistent focus on needs can provide a blueprint for creating socio-ecological systems that nurture life. Where do we start? Again, this has been very useful distinction, and you can probably imagine why. It's really enhances empathy and which leads to compassionate action. So how do we go about it? Again, a lot of you are probably aware of this. In order to develop awareness and responsiveness, the focus is on psychological flexibility. And I should have actually cited a lot of these statements I've got in here. I think this was a quote from an article that Steve Hayes et al. I'm not sure who the et al. Is now, authored, where I'm citing, perspective taking, empathy, psychological flexibility have been shown to underpin a tendency to care about others. So this is the glue in all the work that I've done, and I know Paul and others have done through ProSocial, have done, to the extent that people become more self-aware and responsive, psychologically flexible. It's the glue that allows everything else to work. If anyone is self-censoring and editing or performing to please, or actually not showing up, you know, they're checking out at the doorway and leaving their heart and mind onto the pillow when they're coming to work, it doesn't actually result in the kind of work and change that we're striving for. So having focused on this and developing, you know, high levels of self-determination, another important facet of our work is developing a sense of vision of a preferred and probable future. And this, for a small group, can be just a matter of asking a miracle question. You know, what would it look like in several years if? Or you can go right to the other extreme and do forms of foresighting, you know, and scenario planning. It's really important. And so this is the question about, where do we want to be? And I think in today's world, this is a critically important question, given the intractable problems that we're facing. And but it also invites people to acknowledge that we're dealing in many ways with the ineffable. You know, what we have to turn our attention to and change is in many ways we're not aware of it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in. And so this is a deep and engaging discussion as well. And in the work that I've done, it's a segue to this kind of work. Much of the work that I've done has been at the level of systems, you know, organizations and multi-stakeholder organizations. And I'll speak to some of these more a bit later in the presentation. And this particular approach that I've learned has been informed by some systems engineers at the ANU, a chap named Matt Doolan particularly, and his team, who are very much into clean energy production and well-functioning systems. And the thing that I learned from these folk, who think very practically, is how to actually get a system working, you know, to a desired specification over long-term timeframes. Some of the innovation roadmaps that they worked on were up to 30 years out, where they looked at entire rail sectors, energy grids, food supply chains, the manufacture of cars. And the thing that I loved was that how incredibly pragmatic it was. They'd identify this opportunity. They'd invite, in some cases, up to 120 organizations to the table that represented systems as large as 350, where their interests were placed on the table. And they identified a whole range of opportunities and qualified them fit for vision and fit for capability. So their vision, for example, to have a system working to a certain specification would be the full suite would be this pie chart of opportunities, which involved the invention of technology, the development of policy, the investment of funding, all sorts of things. And that whole pie chart had to actually come together to form the vision. We always did this robust trend analysis. We identified critical factors, social, technological, environmental, economic, political, legal, ethical, and in many cases, spiritual trends and drivers that were selecting behaviors that needed to be responded to if the vision was to be realized. We did a thorough audit of the capability of the system. So in this work, we came up with lots of opportunities. I thought, that's a great idea. But before we invested in them, we made sure we had the capability of doing it, which is often an underdone conversation, I've recognized. And so we'd do a thorough audit of the capability of the system and then coordinate our effort to actually move in the desired direction. And where there were gaps, we would close them. Very robust. And when I was working with Matt, this was the missing bit of my jigsaw. The work that Paul and I were doing were focused very much on the psychological well-being of individuals within more immediate social contexts. And this pushed it right up to the broad systemic level for me. And I said to Matt, this has been my missing jigsaw, and equally, he looked at the work that Paul and I were doing and said, what you're doing is what we're missing out on. We haven't turned our attention to the human dimension of our work. One of the roadmaps that Matt and his team were working on when I first met them was the manufacture of electric cars with a range of organizations in Southeast Asia. And about 4 years in, the whole road mapping endeavor collapsed because of corruption and opportunism. And so Matt and I teamed up and married the idea of developing SciFlex, and married the idea of developing SciFlex and developing the capacity for dialogue that takes into account human needs and developing self-determination with his work of doing scenario planning and strategic road mapping, but then integrated into it Ostrom's work, the work that David and Paul particularly have been doing, and an evolutionary perspective. And with the organizations we worked with, once they developed this vision and a suite of opportunity, they'd done a trend analysis, we then and had on this table this suite of this pie chart of opportunities. We asked, okay, how are you going to implement these principles? Now you've got a sense of identity and purpose. What does equity look like at each level in the system? How are you going to make sure that everybody who's implicated by a decision is going to be included? How are you going to monitor the whole thing from a technological level right up to the human cultural level? And when things aren't working, how are you going to respond in helpful ways? And when things are working, how are you going to reinforce them so that what is working is retained? Those variations are selected and replicated. And when conflict emerges, what does restorative approaches look like? And how do you implement these principles at every level? And so for Matt, this was a revelation. It completely changed the approach that he was taking to his work. And all that together was the prelude to participatory action learning. And this is very much a behavioral, informed by behavioral approach to what we're doing. It's, I think it's a well-accepted fact that whole cloth change for an individual or a group just doesn't automatically emerge. Relapse is utterly natural. And for individuals who are striving to change the way they behave, you expect at least 3 to 5 relapses before the beginning of habituated behavior starts to emerge, let alone as a group. And so acknowledging that relapse is utterly natural and helping people to pause and reflect on what's occurring and reset and reboot and continue to try new things or to reinforce what's working, shifts the culture to one of learning. As a stark contrast to the very punitive approaches that are generally employed. And so these action learning cycles generally go on for at least 6 to 8 cycles, and sometimes longer. In all of my work, the action learning processes have gone for 4 to 6 months generally before there's a real pause and reflection on how far we've gotten. So that's the an overview of the method. And whenever I've worked with a client, what we're doing is stitched together in an infographic, something like this. There's a lot of cycles here. Generally, it's not all of them, it's some of them. We onboard people by undertaking a listening tour in order to make sense of what's going on. Self-development is always a part of it. But then there are the cycles that I've just spoken to. Strategic agenda setting, doing a trend analysis, implementing pro-social forms of governance, qualifying opportunities, engaging action learning, and then road mapping if the system wants to scale things up. Many groups are very interested in the foundational sciences, particularly the evolutionary approach that we're taking, and so that features. And but also research is involved. It is interdisciplinary research agendas are set, and case clinics are often featured. So that's the approach. But philosophically, this is what's undergirding it, and this really interests me actually, and I'm sure many of you. Over the years of doing this work, I've constantly asked myself, how do we actually learn and evolve? And this is where I have a huge debt of gratitude to David and Paul, where I've taken a huge insight into how to think about my work from an evolutionary perspective. And I've grown to appreciate that that we evolve along these 3 broad dimensions: biologically, which there's an emphasis on genetic and epigenetic evolution, and all the the biophysical aspects of it, and but also there's non-verbal behavioral, which is an integration of operant and respondent conditioning, particularly informed by Skinner's work, but also aspects of behavioral modeling and imprinting. And then there's a capacity for language. There's verbal, behavioral, and symbolic cultural evolution, which is covered. That's the domain of relational responding and symbolic inheritance, and all forms of verbal communication and cultural practices. And the unit of analysis is the ongoing act in context. What is going on at these 3 levels that's enabling us to evolve healthily. But the big question that I ask is, what's the function of language in this composite? And I've grown to appreciate that there's these 2 classes of knowing. There's non-verbal knowing and verbal knowing. We're sensory. We sense things. There's sensory perception, but there's conceptual experience. So there's this environmental input. We see, we taste, we touch, we hear things, we smell. We have interoceptive and proprioceptive capabilities, which enable us to keep balance and a sense of orientation in our environment. But we've learned to name all this stuff, all this sensory input. We label it, we elaborate on it, we analyze things, we judge, we set goals, we plan, we compare things, we remember and we ruminate, we self-reflect. It's quite extraordinary, our capacity to describe all that we sense. And for me personally, I have to acknowledge that the amount we sense is just a fragment of what's actually going on. It's about turning our attention to what is ultimately ineffable, and being able to enhance these natural processes that enable us to evolve. And language is an incredibly powerful tool. So the function of language. We learn to observe and discriminate a world, make sense of it, and describe it in more or less useful ways, which in turn enables us to act in relation to it with varying degrees of effect. I think this is extraordinary. You know, we might describe the feeling of falling in love and communicate with someone. It has us acting with affection. But also we might look across a valley and perceive the potential of building a city and design a whole city that has a circular economy that's actually integrated with the environment. So our capacity for language, you know, to actually observe and discriminate a world, make sense of it, and describe it in more or less useful ways that enables us to act with love and compassion or build cities that are actually healthy is extraordinarily powerful. I think for me personally, it's the most powerful tool that we've got. And the question is, how do we do this so that we can track what we're doing much more effectively in relation to what is valued, particularly in today's world, which is screaming for help. And so this is a quote from one of the latest books on relational frame theory, which has largely informed my work. It's the theory that I based my PhD on, that Paul helped me with, supervised me with. And the quote is, relational frame theory provides a precise and empirically supported account of the contingencies that select cognitive processes, how cognitive agents can get established developmentally, and perhaps more importantly, how the relationships between verbal behavior and other behaviors are established and regulated. I've found this very insightful. And just to kind of open this up a little bit, I'd like to kind of invite you a little bit into this discussion. If I was to ask you, what's at the source of action or inaction? You know, what would you say? And I'd like folk to open up their mic now, or maybe even pop a few words in the chat in response to that question. Maybe just open up your chat and pop some words in the chat. So mark competing commitments, motivation, context, courage, fear, values, expectation of change, motivating, abolishing operations, needs. It's really interesting, isn't it? We're using language to describe a learning history. Thanks, Charles. So it's interesting. We're using apathy, yep, responsibility, discriminative stimuli. It's great. It's amazing, isn't it? We can use words to describe a context. Love. Thank you, Dunia. I wanted that word to show up. I'm going to suggest that it's the way the world occurs to us. All the words that we've just used describe a perspective that we're taking. It's the way in which we discriminated a context, which then elicits a response. And whether you find this a useful framing, because again, these are just symbols. There's nothing ultimately true about what I've got on the screen or what you've got in the chat. None of it is a direct readout on reality. But these words help us to discriminate what's occurring to us as a stimulus for action or inaction, which then leads to the results we get. And just to really draw this distinction out, I've got this quote from Helen Keller, and I'd like to invite someone to actually read this out for us. When I first read this, it just illustrated the point that we're orbiting around now so beautifully. So would someone like to volunteer to read this out for us?
Sure.
Thank you.
Can you
Thanks.
hear okay?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Go for it. Yep.
The most important day I remember in all my life is the one on which my teacher, Ann Mansfield Sullivan, came to me. I am filled with wonder when I consider the immeasurable contrasts between the two lives which it connects. It was the 3rd of March, 1887, 3 months before I was 7 years old. Have you ever been at sea in a dense fog when it seemed as if a tangible white darkness shut you in, and the great ship, tense and anxious, groped her way toward the shore with plummet and sounding line, and you waited with beating heart for something to happen? It was like that ship before my education began, only I was without compass or sounding line and had no way of knowing how near the harbor was. Light, give me light, was the wordless cry of my soul, and the light of love shone on me that very hour. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew that WATER meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, was hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that could in time be swept away. I left the well house eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. That was because I saw everything with the strange new sight that had come to me. She even looks a little bit like Patty Duke, doesn't she?
Yeah. Extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
She was deaf, dumb, and blind. It's amazing. And language gave her sight. It's extraordinary, isn't it? We see that we see. So what's going on here? And this is, for me, is where the insights of relational frame theory and the behavioral sciences have informed me significantly. You know, Helen, she was orienting toward this cool something flowing over her hand. Well, actually, before I do a dive into this little infographic that's on the screen, I want to say that these words, relating, orienting, motivating, and evoking, are facets of the one single response. And I want to use Helen as the example to unpack them. I've found this little infographic also very informative in the work that I'm doing. So in that moment, Helen was orienting toward this cool something flowing over one hand and the fast and slow movement of her teacher writing the word water in the other hand. And it was evoking a huge array of emotional responses. She mentions the words thrill and freedom, hope, joy, mystery, as she was relating what she was feeling with one hand and feeling with the other hand. And this capacity to orient toward what we're sensing, what she was sensing, and relate them to one another, evoked this incredibly positive emotional response. And the putative motivating response was also very positive. She said that as a result of that, she was eager to learn, and that everything she touched quivered with life. It's quite extraordinary. So she learned to observe and discriminate her world and make sense of it and describe it in more useful ways. Actually, I shouldn't have said useful in her case. It actually, she went on to invent Braille and do all sorts of things. It was just amazing. And so for me, this is a very useful unit of analysis, really, because in all my work, at any level of the system, whether it's an individual, a group, or a group of groups, I ask myself, the work that I try and do is to change their orientation and evoking what they're oriented toward and what is being evoked as a consequence of that orientation and what they're discriminating and relating together. And as a consequence, the putative motivation is always healthier. And so how do these classes of relating actually evolve? Like Helen learned this WATER equals this cool something running over my hand. But she was also years later able to write those 3 paragraphs that were just read out. It's just extraordinary how we can learn words, name things, objects or events or feelings, put them into relationship with each other and develop whole philosophies. And so again, and here I'd like to invite Stu Libman to read this out, because he and I actually wrote this table together in another article that we co-authored, which attempts to track the evolution of language in relation to establishing a normative context within which kindness is expressed and or experienced. So Stu, would you be kind enough?
Well, you're inviting us to notice each statement's putative motivational strength toward establishing a socio-cultural normative context within which kindness is expressed and or experienced. And then as we move down the table, it's that same diagram you showed in the preceding slide, right, Robert?
Yeah.
But at each level becoming a little bit more complex. So it's a matter of not just putting words together, but it's connecting ideas and then starting to connect ideas with other ideas and expanding upon that until we get to the point where in your presentation, relating relational networks has us seeking to keep in mind all of what you began with, leading to this, inviting us to then track the progression that reflects an evolutionary account of how our individual and collective roaming establishes increasingly sophisticated forms of verbally regulated responding to our own responding. So now we're not only linking the various ideas you've been presenting across your presentation, but inviting us to pay attention to how we're taking it in, what we're orienting to, what's getting stirred up in us, and what impact that's having on our motivation to understand more of what you're seeking to put before us.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. And so do you want to read the list of statements? Like mum equals that cuddly person. So this is where Helen started with
Right,
water.
that's the mutual entailing. So there's a word that stands for something. And then relational framing is where we start to connect things up. So mom is kind to dad, and dad is kind to mom. I can be kind too. So now we're coordinating these various statements. My family strives to be kind and honest. I will too. So now we've got the relation of part to whole of me to my family. For relational networking, we're talking about rule following that involves various classes of relational frames. I want to be a good person, like my family and many others I have come to know. given all I have experienced, kindness and honesty are virtues I want to live by. So there in relational networking, we're seeing how the words from mutual entailing and the frames from relational framing start to come together in terms of the way we can put rules together. And then there's analogical and metaphorical reasoning. How might living the values of kindness and honesty transcend the need for laws to govern our behavior? Redressing self-destructive behaviors by developing psychological flexibility is like tending kindly to the wounded child within. So the is like part of it is how we start to relate those relations in a more complex way. And then we move on to relating relational networks, to starting to link ideas, to get into problem solving. So we have comparisons of extended narrative and complex problem solving. How can we establish a multicultural society that seeks truth and goodness throughout all its endeavors? How do we adopt deliberative approaches that leverage collective wisdom on the practice of kindness and honesty? In other words, now we're into what we might call thinking, but all based in language, as you were saying before, Robert. When people filled in that first circle in that 3-circle diagram, right? We were doing it all in language, thinking about what you put before us, and then starting to relate ideas to come up with the answers that we proposed in the chat. Pretty cool, Robert.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you, Stu. So it's
Sure.
quite extraordinary, isn't it? Our capacity for language is absolutely extraordinary. And so this all can be framed in terms of a 3-term contingency: stimulus, response, and consequence. And so if you're a behavioral scientist, the question is, how do you manipulate the context within which this verbal behavior is taking place? So that you can change the orienting and evoking. And the suggestion is by changing the dynamic nature and the strength of the verbal context along these 4 dimensions: the coherence, complexity, derivation, and flexibility. So let me just speak a little bit to those. So, and when I get to the case studies in a minute, you'll probably get a sense of how these 4 manipulable varies featured. So in terms of the coherence of our worldviews, our stories and theories, I invite people to ask, so how well do they actually cohere with previously established bodies of knowledge and evidence that you have either learned directly or have been shown in other ways to enhance, functional responses in similar contexts? So are your worlds of words actually coherent in the sense that they cohere with what works? And in terms of complexity, we just went through a table, and at each level, the verbal repertoire became more complex. From mummy is that kind, cuddly person, to actually how do we, facilitate a discourse, which brings together multiple cultures and philosophical worldviews in the service of kindness. And so involving our philosophical worldviews and narratives about the world and our personal and group strivings, how can we evolve them so they actually entail more adequately to the prevailing context, past, present, and future? And so this is, you can imagine when you're doing foresighting and road mapping, these verbal contexts are very complex. And this complexity needs to actually be an adequate representation of what ultimately is ineffable. It's what is actually breathing life into us and the world, and the future, which is actually, the future. And then derivation, so we can facilitate deliberative processes that probe for the fundamental needs that sustain human and more than human life. and the value that each actor can realize in the context of collective efforts. So we can derive new things, but also we can hold our worlds of words very lightly and flexibly. How can we deliteralize our worlds of words, these symbolic niches in which we habit, whether they're niches that are kind of rendered by the committee between our ears, or they're handed down to us as a philosophical, religious worldview. How can we free ourselves up from rigid, dogmatic, and unhealthy repertoires of behavior and use language functionally? That's the question that I often ask myself. And I'm not going to do a deep dive into this, but I'll very quickly overview it, and then we'll get into these case studies. And so kind of looking at what we've just discussed, if within the context of acting in a direction toward a preferred and probable future, we can orient toward that, where we craft a relationship that's equivalent to we is equivalent to a preferred future. And that's what happens when you do ask the question, what would a preferred future look like? What would it look like if we actually implemented Ostrom's design principles to actually move in that direction? And where do we want to be? Where are we now? And how can we get there? That can be distilled into we equal that preferred and probable future if we act on these opportunities. And then you start taking a journey of participatory action learning. So you try stuff. So in the past, you had this conversation, but then after a while, you're still asking yourself the question, are we still equivalent to a preferred future? And so you reconceive it and you historically track it. And then a bit further down the line, again, there is these moments in time where you've reperceived yourself in relation to a preferred future as you're moving toward it. And the idea is you continue to reconceive yourself in relation to that future based on your history of behavior by doing things like developing self-determination, strategic agenda setting for a preferred and probable future, responding to systemic trends and drivers, establishing pro-social constitutional arrangements, etc. And so that is the philosophically what has underpinned my work and continues to do so. And in fact, the work of Paul and David and others. And so what kind of things did we get up to? So in the article that David Paul and I recently authored, one of the case studies that we wrote about was with the Museum of Australian Democracy here in Canberra. And this woman you can see on screen, Daryl Karp, her name is, she was the CEO. She got the job in 2013, and she actually moved on to an agency in Sydney last year. I had dinner with her and her husband just after she'd finished her 10-year term. She had 2 5-year terms. And Daryl, she's an extraordinary woman, extraordinary woman. She stepped into the role of CEO of a small museum. I'll just go to the next slide. You'll see this is in Canberra. This is Old Parliament House, this white building in the front. And in the back is New Parliament House. And so this Old Parliament House is now the Museum of Australian Democracy. And when I teamed up with Daryl, she'd been about 12 months in the job. And she used to work for ABC TV. She was a documentary maker, very creative. And she found herself in charge of a very traditional and staid museum where they exhibited the traditional colonial view of Australian history and democracy in this country. And she really wanted to change that and challenge the status quo. And she wasn't quite sure how to go about it. She heard about the work that I was doing at the ANU, and this was very soon after I teamed up with Matt Dolan. And she said, look, I'd love it if once I'd talked about, the approach that I was taking, she said, I'd love it if you come and do some work with us. And I said to her, look, Matt and we've just teamed up. Would you like to be a guinea pig? So this was the first organization where I wove together the work of developing psychological flexibility and implementing Ostrom's principles with a robust approach to developing purpose and direction based on Matt Doolan's strategic road mapping. And it was an 8-month gig, and I went back several times over the following years for different periods. And the program looked pretty much like this. We almost went through the entire thing. Actually, we did. Now I'm looking at it. We did all of these cycles. And but you'll notice at the top, there's this strategic agenda setting question. This really tipped the conversation over. In the first deliberation, we had these half-day deliberations where we met, the executive and all the team leaders. There are probably about 30 odd people in the room that represented a staff of about 150. And occasionally all the staff would become involved. But in the first conversations, I was asking, so what is your purpose? And many of them said, oh, we host school tours and we host exhibitions. And the maintenance team said, oh, we look after a heritage building. And what's your vision? And they said, oh, to survive, the turmoil that the kids, introduce us to every time they come through in busloads, and just to get an exhibition up on time, and to make sure the bricks don't fall off. And so they didn't have much of a vision. And so the pathway into this was a 3-step thing. So what are you really interested in? And how can we turn that into a strategic agenda setting question? And so they started talking about their interests, and we ended up converging on this question. They really cared about young people, about deliberative and democratic processes and civil liberties, that preserved future generations. So the question they converged on was, how can we help the youth of Australia engage with and interpret our social and political history, and in doing so, be inspired to explore the future of deliberative and democratic processes and the preservation of the civil liberties of future generations? So that's a very evocative question. Thinking about roaming, what does that have you orient toward, and what does it evoke? It's interesting, isn't it? And the sense that these groups started making of their context as a result of this question was just extraordinary. Darryl and the executive, they realized that if they were going to move in a direction where they were going to able to develop a new museum that challenged the beliefs of people who walked through the door rather than reinforce them, they had to tread a very careful path and develop very different relationships with other cultural institutions and universities. And they realized that the way in which they were presently constituted wasn't going to allow for that. They were an ordinary government department and locked into the annual budget cycle. So they got an allocation of funds every year. And if they didn't spend it all, they had to give what they didn't spend back. And so, like all government departments, toward the end of the financial year, there's a flurry to spend what they've got so they don't get less next year. So they put in a proposal to become a statutory authority with their own board and control over their own budget, which they got over the following years, which then enabled them to develop very different relationships with a number of institutions, not only in Australia, but around the world. And that trajectory headed them off on a path which later earned them the recognition of being one of the most innovative small museums in the world. The school tours group is another example. They thought, gosh, we can do much more than just tolerate busloads of kids. We can work with the education department and school teachers in our community to develop a new curriculum and further the qualifications of the teachers of these students. And so they got together with teachers they redesigned their entire tour program, so it integrated with school curricula, and started tag teaming with the exhibition team, who started putting on exhibitions that invited students to ask very evocative questions about what issues to do with equity and inclusion and the plight of Indigenous folk in Australia, all sorts of things. But in order to host exhibitions that were evocative rather than repulsive, because most people go to a museum to get their beliefs reinforced, they teamed up with Canberra University and designed some of the most innovative exhibitions that were highly interactive, that kids could draw all over walls and press on interactive screens to vote on stuff and see the changing levels of perspectives on these issues. It was just quite amazing. They ended up developing a youth leadership centre, many things. I went back. There was lots of coaching. All of this is coaching, participatory action learning, where groups try stuff, they come together, they reflect on what they've done, and often with the help of a coach, me and my colleagues, and then they would try new things. It was just extraordinary. Equally, this column of photos on the side, this is the Department of Finance, and they were the Property and Construction Division. They were responsible for looking after all government real estate, virtual and actual. And the Deputy Secretary, who was in charge of this division, Stacey Hall, her name is, she was previously a lawyer. She'd been in charge of this division for about a year and a half. It had 5 branches, and she'd heard about the work that I'd done at the museum, but also in other contexts through the ANU, the Australian National University, and sought me out. And I remember the day that I spoke to her, and she said, look, a year and a half ago, the secretary asked me to come into this division and sort it out. And I said, so what happened? And she explained that about 2.5, 3 years before she stepped in, 2 divisions merged. And one division were responsible for actually looking after physical real estate, as well as the virtual the online infrastructure of the government. And the other division were policy people. And during that election cycle, the policy team had been asked by the government to divest the government of as much real estate as possible so they could save money. And Stacey said that the day they merged, the Hunger Games began. And essentially, the technical folk felt like the policy people were selling their job. And when we hosted the first division-wide forum to introduce this series of cycles that were in the program that I introduced before, because we went through pretty much the whole series of cycles with that division as well, the faction stood up and yelled at each other across the room. I'd never seen anything quite like it. It was quite amazing. But anyway, so with this department, what they did was that they looked down the road, and when they crafted a similar question, it was like, what would all government spaces, virtual and actual, look like if they were clean and green and safe for every citizen on this planet? That was essentially their strategic agenda setting question. And when the technical folk looked down the road and started to think about their own role in that context, when they did their trend analyses and their foresighting and all that kind of thing, they saw themselves as having to become a hub within an increasingly distributed network of stakeholders nationally and internationally. And as they were making that inquiry, orienting toward this world, what was evoked was quite extraordinary. They realized, heck, this is a policy issue. Guess what? We need your help, guys. The policy teams, they looked down the road and saw the same world, but they realized that they had to learn to give courageous policy advice. I can remember one of the teams saying, we've got to learn to stick our head up over the pulpit instead of being scared of having it shot off at Senate estimates. And they realized, heck, this is a technical issue. And so these mid-careerers, the late 30, early 40-year-olds and their teams just got a fire in their belly. And at these division-wide forums, these top and bottom photographs are snapshots of the forums. These teams were given the stage to present the outputs of their action learning. And they'd had this slide pack showing, they called it Operation Voltron, this whole process of transforming the division. And they had this, this big machine transforming itself. And the charts that were on this top chart here is the CDP spoke diagram. This is at the end of the whole. I wonder if I can zoom in a bit. It's you can see the rating is pretty good. When the first CDP chart we did, this spoke diagram was really small. This was the last cycle in the series after they'd done their foresighting, converged on the opportunities, and figured out how they were going to cooperate. And they rated how well they were implementing the design principles. And it was up there. It was this massive, massive improvement. And the charts that they were using, they stuck on the walls of the department so they could continue the deliberation between the division-wide forums. And so the cycle was, I met with the executive and the branch heads, and they gave me a team of people, and I said, I want to stay in the shadows. I just work in the passenger seat of those I'm working with. This is your conversation, not mine. I'd completely given up the idea of traditional consulting by this stage, thinking that I was an expert and knew everything. Whereas all I could do was actually help them orient toward what is healthy and try new things and retain what worked. And so I had a team. We translated slides and things that I had into their material. They ended up developing a manual so they could keep facilitating these processes and their own charts. And so this kind of charts that I used were turned into these. And the results we got were amazing. So this is what featured in our article. At the end of the year that I worked with Daryl and her team at the museum, the Australian Public Service Commission rang her up and said, what's going on? Because your state of the service data has changed extraordinarily. So every year, the Australian Public Service Commission does a census and invites every single public servant to fill out this very extensive survey that assesses the health of the Australian public service along about 6 major dimensions, as well as agency-specific dimensions. Anyway, they rang up. They rang Daryl. She told me that this woman rang her. She said, something's wrong with your state of the service data because against your baseline of measures over previous years, they've shot up through the roof. And she sent an email, and these are the measures that were in the email. This one here, managers value their employees went up by 25%. And this is in comparison with the average across the entire public service. So all the red are the rest of the public service. These blue ones are within MOAD. What's this? The workplace provides effective learning, went up 19%. I feel strong attachment to my agency, went up 16%. And these are the full suite of measures for MOAD for that year. It's just quite extraordinary. And for the Department of Finance, and so this is for MOAD. The recent story is I worked very intensely with MOAD for just under a year. And then I went back several times over subsequent years and worked with discrete teams and as well as the executive. And then last year, I met the wife of the new CEO. No, the wife, sorry, I met the wife of a guy that I know that I'm building a guitar with, believe it or not, who is the EA of the new CEO. And And I was having a cup of tea with her, and she had no idea that I'd worked with the museum. And she started telling this story about she got this new job. And she said, it was amazing. I've never been into a government agency that's been so positive and so innovative, and started telling me stories about what it's like. And I said, well, guess what? You know, back in 2014, 15, and she said, really, you've got to meet my new boss. And so in February this year, I went over to the museum and I met the new CEO and the deputy, Andrew, his name is, and Andrew was with me at the time that I worked there. And so over about an hour and a half, you know, Andrew and I waltzed down memory lane and said, oh, remember when we did this? Oh, that turned into this. And I then asked if they could give me access to the state of the service data for following years. And so they send me the results for 2019 and 2022. And these are the major categories. So all of these measures chunk down into these categories: employee engagement, whether they want to whether they have a say, they want to stay, and whether they're happy with what they're striving for. Another class of measures to do with communication, innovation, and change, senior leadership, immediate supervisor, current job and workplace performance, and code of conduct. And so here's your 2014 results, which is before the original intervention. This is immediately following, and these are represented in the following bar graphs. But then in 2019 and 2022, look where they are. So they went up in that first year, but then they just continued to climb. Like, that amazed me 8 years later. And the Department of Finance with Stacey and her team, this is the year that we went through the same cycle of processes. Formal performance feedback helps performance, went up by 28%. What's this one here? I am proud to work for my agency. No, that's not it. I would recommend my agency as a place to work, went up by 24%. This is the shift in a team that were described as playing the Hunger Games. It's quite amazing. And again, I got the data for 2018, and the green line shows that it's continued to grow against a bunch of measures, if not stay much the same. But there's an unpublished bit to this story. In 2019, Stacey moved on and a new CEO came in. And Stacey rang me and she said, look, the division is falling apart. And I've had the 5 branch heads that we worked with reach out and ask for help. And what had happened is that a new deputy secretary had stepped in, and I'm told she'd read an article on what the optimal size of a team was, and she did this arbitrary restructure. And according to the branch heads that I spoke to, they said that their team leaders were coming to them in tears, saying all the work we did through Operation Voltron has just been torn apart. And so I met with them several times over a couple of months to try and help them have a different conversation with this new head of division, but they couldn't do it. She was very rigid, and I learned within 6 months all of those branch heads had left. And I actually approached the census department and asked for census data following these years under the Freedom of Information Act, and they wouldn't share it, which is really interesting. So one more case, a couple more very quick snapshots, because I'll invite Beth to share these slides afterwards and you can read through it. We've done work with San Antonio in ProSocial World, where we with the Charter for Compassion, where we teamed up with a group of representatives from 5 different organizations who did a listening tour. They were taught how to interview key people from these 5 organizations who are striving to make their institutions more compassionate, so we could identify what critical factors were enabling them to actually evolve to become more compassionate. And these are the factors. which reinforced what it is we're doing in ProSocial, which is enhancing autonomy, the capacity to listen, collaboration, particularly based on the CDPs, and of course they centered compassion. And so you can read about that. This report is published on our site, and these are the kind of outputs that were from that. Here's another example where I worked with the governments across the Pacific Ocean as they're endeavoring to collaborate to tackle all climate-related issues, and particularly human infrastructure, food, particularly the oceans, because they rely on fish a lot, as well as traditional securities issues. And they identified these critical factors related to regional politics, climate change, social, cultural norms, the economies of and livelihoods of their countries, the nature of infrastructure, technology change. These were the factors that they then responded to, going through a whole suite of action learning processes. And again, there's published articles demonstrating the impact. And this is what the deliberations look like as they oriented toward a world that they wanted, and the responses were extraordinary. So there's a whole lot here. These are tribes around freshwater lakes in Nigeria who are starving, who learn to collaborate in order to look after themselves and their lake. We've got in Latin America, we had a huge constellation of groups. This was a 3-year ProSocial project where these institutions here, the Earth Regenerators, Conviver La Junga, there's education institutions, environmental conservation groups and universities, as well as social change organizations work together to enhance collaboration to huge effect. And so I haven't got time to go into all of these things. Ho Chi Minh Academy of Political Leadership. Here's where I worked with 50 young Communist Party leaders to do 5 roadmaps for the country. You can see here's the CDP spoke diagram. All wonderful work. Paul and I went to the UN and worked with 4 organizations to help them figure out how to collaborate more effectively. So I won't labor on these. In Bhutan, I work with the government to help them implement gross national happiness. It's just beautiful work. So my parting question to you, who are the custodians of your future, and what kind of deliberations would you like to be able to have with them? What do you want to orient them toward and evoke in them to have them act in a direction that's not just good for them, but for all of us? So Q&A. It was a bit of a rush. I hope it was coherent.
Absolutely. That was so fantastic, Robert. Thank you so much. Would anybody like to raise their hands?
Susan.
Thank you, Robert. I've heard some pieces of that over the time we've worked together, and this was a beautiful and coherent and comprehensive, and well, comprehensive to me. I know you said you've left a bunch of stories out, just showing how effective groups can be when they really do concentrate on what matters most to them. So just applause, applause. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. And look, and I feel very drawn at the moment to acknowledge my dear friends Paul and David and the team, Susan, Beth, and others. It's Dunia's here. It's if it wasn't for my relationship with folk like you, I wouldn't have learned what I've learned. So thank you. This is our work, not just mine.
I want to, one point I want to make is that our article was that our online magazine, which has published hundreds of articles that are not peer reviewed has now become also a peer reviewed journal. And I think that it could perform the same function as the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science. So I invite people here to think about writing articles for This View of Life as peer reviewed journal or regular articles, so that we can build up the kind of the paper with Paul and Robert represent. So please think about writing for This View of Life for any ProSocial applications. That would be awesome.
I've just posted the link to the article. Duncan.
Thanks, Robert. That was amazing as always. What struck me was the work in the finance department, where all it took was a single person to undo all of that collective work.
Yeah.
It just shows how vulnerable. Is there a way of, I mean, I know it's the self-interest and it's the group interest at low levels and all of that, but wow, one person can undo all of that. That I wasn't I thought there would be more power in the collective to preserve.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because I'm glad you kind of brought that up, Duncan, because I didn't want to paint what we've been doing as like a silver bullet. You know, it works, and I know I've met most of these individuals since, and it hasn't all been lost because they're still continuing to move in a direction that's good for them. But I think this goes to the point that David often makes. You know, we've got to shift toward enlightened top down, bottom up. You know, and there's a different kind of governance that actually has to emerge. You know, there's benefits from centralized forms of governance, but also there's benefits from open competition. But clearly those two don't work in and of themselves or together. You know, there's strengths in them that we need to preserve, but there's something new that's got to emerge. And I think that's what we're in the process of experimenting with. And it's true. I think we've all seen the best made plans of mice and men overturned overnight. Yeah. But I think it's a matter of continuing to choose to act in that direction. Jason. David, were you about to say something?
Well, yeah, very, very quickly, that the B Corp movement experiences this again and again, that a business corporation that is highly pro-social, that they can succeed spectacularly, but then they can be purchased, basically acquired by another company, and frankly just dismembered. And so in response to that, they created a new form of governance, benefit corporation, which basically, by virtue of its governance laws, makes that more difficult. So I think there's some sense in which you can protect against takeovers, basically, and that sort of thing. Work on that structure. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Thanks, David. Jason.
Yeah, thanks again, Robert, for the presentation. Super illuminating to see all the work that's going on around the world. Very inspiring stuff. I also appreciated the deep dive you did on the RFT stuff, kind of making that more approachable. I was curious about to what degree that information comes up when you do this work with groups. Do you dive deep on like language processes, verbal behavior, and its influence on overt behavior?
Overtly, not so much. You know, as I think for the team of researchers, yes. You know, I know that some time ago we began a similar process with folk in the ProSocial Health Circle, and I invited David along to do a keynote on the philosophical underpinnings of it, and we touched on evolutionary theory and aspects of that there.
From working with self to working with others. ProSocial Action Lab.
Oh. Or is it a featured voice? Yeah, so I think when we're engaging in formal research, absolutely. I mean, for us, it is front and center, you know, the function of language and cognition. And you know, you probably know that we're unpacking this in terms of the symbotype, you know, and what it means in terms of the epigenetic expression of symbolic constructs, you know, and so that's still a work in process. And so I think it's a really important body of our work, and I'm very excited to continue working with it. But you know, when we're working with groups, you know, who are indigenous or you know, just flat out in the healthcare sector or something like that, then it's supporting them in relation to what they're oriented toward, you know, and to evolve in a healthy direction. And if the time comes when they want to do a deep dive into the underpinning sciences, then absolutely we'll go there with them. I know that when you know, we use the matrix or invite them, you know, into different approaches to having a conversation, giving and receiving good information, it opens that door, you know. And the exercise that I introduced you to before, you know, what's the source of action or inaction? I use that often, you know, and you can see how easy it is to step into that world. You know, it's people enjoy, really enjoy entertaining the idea that there's multiple ways in which we can frame up the world, you know, looking at it mechanistically or through an evolutionary lens, or you know, in terms of you know, contextualism. You know, it's that is a liberating in and of itself, which is a step in that direction. So I think, Jason, you know, when there's an appetite, yes, very happy to jump in that deep end. But no, otherwise, you know, like my kids say to me, it's when you get into this stuff, Dad, it's better than a sleeping pill.
And that's my concern too, right? Like I can really geek out on it, but I don't want to put people to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Beth, you had a...
Oh, thank you, Robert. I just put it in the chat. Just wanted to let you all know that this recording will be on YouTube, on the ProSocial World YouTube site. That's all. There's some other things in the chat, but I'll let you all read that. Yes. Anybody else?
And what I'll do later, Beth, too, is you know, the article and the slide pack, and I think the related reports to do with the Charter for Compassion and some others that kind of feature in the slide pack. I think I've shared them with you already, so we can make them available to folk, can't we? Send out a link to the to a Google Drive or something.
Okay, I'll go ahead and send out the link to everybody in attendance.
Yeah. David.
I just wanted to make the point that one reason that the two Australian government cases are so amazing and convincing is because of the assessment that was done. I mean, in the absence of that, it's a good story, but how do you really know? And so, and in most other cases, including the ones you listed, San Antonio and others, so they could have worked just that well, but the fact that they didn't have that assessment dilutes their impact, importance, and impact. And so that makes it imperative for us to do as good as we possibly can on assessment. And unfortunately, we do not have the annual census of the Australian government service to rely upon. We have to do that. That's on us. And so it is an important priority of ProSocial World in order to provide those assessment services. And I think many of the people on this call are potential clients for those services. So, you know, please keep assessment in mind, and then check us out for our own efforts to provide assessment services, often in a customized fashion. So I wanted to make that point.
Thanks, David.
Thank you,
Jason.
Well, I didn't want to lower my hand, but David just answered my question. I was going to say, if one was interested in doing a case study, because I'm actually in the process of running one out myself, where would they reach out to? So it looks like the ProSocial World website. That's the place to go.
or contact anyone at ProSocial World. Finally, I don't mean to keep coming back again and again. We're just starting a new project that's been in the planning stages for a long time on evolutionary case reports. And what that means is that we can use these same tools that we're working with organizations in the present to help evolve their futures. We can also train that same framework on the past by using the information on the history of an organization and then interpreting it from the same perspective. And we're starting quite a large project with anyone who wants to get involved. So anyone who's in a position to write a case report on an organization can join this project. And as a cohort, we'll be providing a rubric, basically, not so different than the playbook that we use for organizations working in the present to interpret their past. So that's super exciting to use the same methodology. And so please indicate an interest to anyone here, and we can include you. That should be launching literally within the next week or two.
Yeah, thanks, David. Paul, I wondered if you wanted to speak to the comment you just posted in the chat.
Oh, I think we're wrapping up. Thanks so much, Robert. That was an extraordinary talk, and I came to a new appreciation of your courage and boldness in trying to cover such territory. But yeah, I just wanted to make that point. I've been thinking about since Duncan's question. In a sense, it's a vindication of what ProSocial and many other people are trying to do to create systems that are more robust. And really, that's a unique property of when there's power over, that you can have systems that are so fragile to individual whims. So that point's probably obvious to everyone, but it just is important that we don't slip into thinking this is a necessary sort of feature of humanity. Thank you. Thanks again.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope this has been of value, and
Been wonderful.
go well with yourselves and with your work, because I believe we're all pulling in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Robert.
Robert. Thanks all.
Bye.